Chris Clemens will present a brief overview of the financial crisis, the banking industry, and Wall Street's role in our foreclosure crisis. Chris and his family have lived in Santa Fe for 28 years. He and his wife, Lannie, have fought the battle against foreclosure, and they hope to help others understand their rights and their resources in protecting their home and property from foreclosure. Chris?
You know, Craig's a tough act to follow because he's so darn intelligent and says so many intelligent things. The rest of us are, but first of all, I think it's important that we all understand what caused this financial crisis. There's a lot of misinformation out there generated by the financial services industry and agreed to, unfortunately, by our president, that, you know, it's homeowners that caused this, the irresponsible homeowners that just took on too much debt. And that's what created this crisis. And the intent of that is to deflect the real reasons for it, guilt and shame, among those of us who got stuck and ended up not being able to pay our mortgages on our underwater homes. This shaming kind of keeps us isolated, you know, keeps us apart from each other so that we can't unify and fight back. So we become, you know, a minority that's oppressed. The guilt's part of their plan, but after you figure out what really happened, the guilt and shame kind of turn to anger. And that's where the reason that this financial crisis happened. Pause and take a breath. Thanks, Lannie. Thanks for putting that in. Okay. In the fall of 2008, the following took place. Our middle class lost between $15 and $20 trillion in household wealth. I'll say that again. Between $15 and $20 trillion disappeared, practically overnight. This is primarily due to the collapse of the real estate market. As we all know, millions of Americans, as well as millions in other countries, lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. Credit markets completely seized up, causing the federal government to inject unprecedented trillions of dollars into our financial institution. The excuse? It was needed to prevent a complete breakdown of the global markets and our economy. That's never happened before. Our government has never got involved in private markets to that extent. The U.S. and the world fell into a deep depression that is still with us, in spite of what you might hear in the corporate media, and will be for years to come. This morning's news on NPR indicated that the median household income decreased for the 5th consecutive year. The income and wealth discrepancy between the extremely wealthy and the rest of us has become the largest since the Great Depression. The toll in human misery from this is extreme. Millions of middle-class families have been forced into joblessness, poverty, and homelessness. The social safety nets that prevent extreme poverty have been strained, and the funds for these important programs are being cut just at the time when they're most needed. Consequently, there's been a large spike in the suicide rate. The massive foreclosures of homes has caused the destructions of our neighborhoods due to vacant homes and the resulting losses to those communities. By most estimates, we are not even close to the end of this. Pause, take a deep breath. So, what caused this to happen in such a short period of time? Short answer is difficult. However, I'm going to refer to the summary of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Report. This is available on the internet. It's about 600 pages, so you probably don't want to print it off. But just reading the first 20 or so pages will give you their summary, which is very important. This is the most extensive review of the financial crisis ever done. This committee read millions of pages of documents, interviewed over 700 witnesses, and had 19 days of public hearings. I'm going to read a few excerpts from this because they hit the nail on the head when it comes to what caused the crisis. They came to the following conclusions. I quote, The captains of finance and the public stewards of our financial system ignored warnings and failed to question, understand, and manage evolving risks within a system essential to the well-being of the American public. Theirs was a big miss, not a stumble. And before I read the next quote, I want to explain what securitization is. Some of you may not know. Securitization was the bundling of individual mortgage loans people took out of their homes into packages. Usually, a package of these might be between 1,000 and 5,000 individual loans. And these were packaged into these things called mortgage-backed securities. And then they were turned into paper and sold on Wall Street. So essentially what happened was our property was turned into paper that could be bought and sold on Wall Street. So when we refer to securitization, that's what we're talking about. And this was unbeknownst to most of us. I certainly didn't know, and I was a fairly sophisticated borrower, I think. Again, quoting from the congressional report, there was an explosion in risky subprime lending and securitization, creating an unsustainable rise in housing prices, widespread reports of egregious and predatory lending practice, dramatic increases in household mortgage debt, exponential growth in financial firms' trading activities, unregulated derivatives, among many other red flags. The tragedy was that they were ignored or discounted. I quote, "The prime example is the Federal Reserve's pivotal failure to stem the flow of toxic mortgages, which it could have done by setting prudent mortgage lending standards. The Federal Reserve was the one entity empowered to do so, and it did not." I quote, "Financial institutions made, bought, and sold mortgage securities they never examined, did not care to examine, and knew to be defective." Quote, "Investors blindly relied on credit ratings agencies as the arbiters of risk. We conclude the failures of credit rating agencies were an essential cog in the wheel of financial destruction. We conclude dramatic failures of corporate governance and risk management at many systemically important financial institutions were a key cause of the crisis. Widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision proved devastating to the stability of the nation's financial markets. The sentries were not at their posts. They had ample power in many arenas and chose not to use it." Quote, "Too big to fail meant too big to manage. The government was ill prepared for the crisis, and its inconsistent response added to the uncertainty and the panic in the financial markets. We conclude there was a systemic breakdown in accountability and ethics." And one final quote, which is very important. "Lenders made loans that they knew borrowers could not afford and that could cause massive losses to investors in mortgage securities and could result in catastrophic consequences." So Congress now knows this, but has done nothing to help homeowners. Are homeowners mentioned at all? Yes. The report points out that household mortgage debt increased 63% from 2001 to 2007. Some people leveraged their property more than was prudent, meaning even a modest dip in the housing market would put them underwater. Once mortgages began to fail, the dip was severe, not moderate. And this was a factor in the collapse. However, the report does not assign the primary blame or anything close to it for the collapse on homeowners. You know, we have to keep in mind that many of these unqualified borrowers were harvested by lenders who knew these loans would fail. There are systems in place designed to prevent this sort of activity, especially for loans that are guaranteed by the FDIC, which ultimately is backed by the taxpayers. Banks are sophisticated. They know what they're doing. Most borrowers are not. Hence the need for regulations to keep the playing field level. When these were ignored for quick profits, disaster was assured. A key point to understand is that banks knew what they were doing. They knew what the future was going to bring. Homeowners didn't. I certainly didn't. President Obama also knows the information in this report, but less than a month ago, he claimed that unwise homeowners were the reason for the financial failure. Yeah, boo. Okay, take it a step further. These failures of these loans were not an accident. They were part of the plan. Even as the wizards that pulled the levers of the financial world made obscene profits from granting these loans with other people's money, they knew that they would further profit when the engineered collapse occurred. The key word here is engineered. This massive recession was planned, and those at the top of the money chain are continuing to reap the profits. There's well-known authors such as Michael Lewis, Matt Taibbi, Greg Palast, Robert James. He's not as well known as they are, but he's a damn good author. They all pointed out years ago that when these financial instruments of destruction were created, the captains of finance, both on Wall Street and those in the public sector, planned to reap huge profits, both from the implementation of these instruments and the planned collapse this would create. Now these same individuals, as Craig mentioned, who created mortgage-backed securities have, since the crash, been purchasing prime properties at fire sale prices made artificially low by an extreme lack of credit available for the vast majority of citizens. Remember, the Great Depression of the 30s was initiated by manipulation of the stock market by a few extremely wealthy, extremely powerful individuals. This manipulation caused the crash of 1929 and the resulting collapse of banks and the economy. Numerous safeguards were put into place to protect the public against such wrongdoing, including a moratorium on foreclosures. Unfortunately, 30 years of deregulation unwound the great majority of these safeguards, the final dooming blow coming in 1988 when the Glass-Steagall Act was undone by Congress and by President Clinton. This, along with tacit bribery of these public officials entrusted with overseeing the financial industry, enabled the wealthy and powerful to covertly manipulate the real estate market, causing our current depression, which is far from over. So this was clearly a setup, but as you will see later this evening from some of the other speakers, in their mad rush to create mortgage loans and sign up homeowners before the crash, banks failed to follow established laws regarding the transfer of the notes and mortgages, which they sold and then resold in the process of securitizing them. Now they're committing massive fraud in the courtroom in an effort to cover up this fact, and I've seen it firsthand, and it's not pretty. As you will hear, when preparing for the judicial process, due diligence and fact-finding will uncover the fact that these banks or loan servicing companies typically do not possess the right to take our homes, which have been caught in the massive Ponzi scheme that the banks perpetrated on us. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.